This lecture is on the respiratory system. In the first part, I'm going to go over the structure of the respiratory system, and we'll talk about the upper respiratory and lower respiratory system, and we'll look at the structures, each one of the structures in greater detail. And towards the end of it, I will talk about respiratory membrane. And then in that respiratory membrane, I want you guys to pay a little bit of attention and remember this one, because once we get into the physiology and the gas exchange, we're going to have to go back and have another look at this one. So respiratory system includes, portion of our respiratory system includes our nasal cavity. So that's our nose, with all the structures in there that we will talk about. From there, we're just going to move down into our throat, which is our pharynx. Not pharynx, pharynx, and then larynx, not larynx, and that's larynx. From there, moving down into our airways, trachea, and then trachea splits into what we call the tracheobronchial tree. That is the passageways, the airways into the lung tissue, and a lung tissue kind of splits these airways, splitting the lung tissue until eventually they reach at the very end and then form the alveoli. I'll go over the details of everything that I have talked about as we move along this lecture, but kind of give you an overview on it. So lungs, 2 of them located within a chest cavity, covered by pleural membrane. And what separates the chest and abdomen from each other is this sheet of muscle over here, which is called the diaphragm. And this is our muscle of breathing. So this is the main respiratory pump right there. Functions of the respiratory system primarily is the collaboration between the respiratory system and a cardiovascular system. So when we talk about the functions of the respiratory system, we really have to remember that primarily it allows us to take the air in, and air contains oxygen, and that's what we need for our survival. That oxygen needs to be transported to all our cells and tissues. And in exchange, when we produce the carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide has to be removed from our body. So there's the exchange that happens there. So if we were to kind of take a look at the functions that happens between the respiratory system and the circular system combined, respiratory system right here is involved for our breathing in and breathing out. And this is called the pulmonary ventilation. We'll take a look at the mechanics of in and out, and then how that happens. And then when we breathe in, the air that we take in has about somewhere between 19 to 21% oxygen. And that oxygen is transported into the lung tissue, and then in exchange for that, CO2 is removed. This is called the external respiration. So this is the gas exchange between the lungs and pulmonary circuit surrounding the lung tissue. So from here, through pulmonary veins, this oxygenated blood is transported into our heart, and from there through the systemic circuit goes into the cells and tissues. Then when it's transported to the level that we have all the capillaries serving cells and tissues, that's where we have exchange of the oxygen, and as CO2 happens at that level. This one over here is called the internal respiration. So I want to reiterate the fact that I need you guys to pay special attention to what we call the pulmonary ventilation, and what's known as external respiration and what's known as internal respiration. So these processes, we need to distinguish them from each other and take a look at the mechanics of each one of them separately. So as for the respiratory system by itself, when we look at the components of the respiratory system, we can actually divide it into 2 different zones. And these zones are classified based on the fact that the gas exchange is happening or not, or these passageways only serve as conduits. So areas of the respiratory system that are known as conducting zones These are the areas that are only for passageway, so they only allow for the air to pass through. And once we get to the very last portion of these conductive zones, where we have the possibilities of carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange happening, these areas are known as respiratory zones. Now, these are the areas of the respiratory zones that actually have these air sacs that are called alveoli. That's where the oxygen and a carbon dioxide exchange happens. The only areas that are considered to be the respiratory zones are the bronchioles, the respiratory bronchioles that connect to alveolar ducts and from there to the alveolar sacs. So, function at this place is to allow for the oxygen to be diffused into our circulatory system and carbon dioxide to be diffused from the circulatory system. Now, components of the respiratory system, and then all these different zones, our respiration depends on our diaphragm, which is our the respiratory pump. But then, in addition to the diaphragm, we have these also other muscles that are called the accessory muscles. Scalenes, internal and external intercostals. We'll go over these and talk about those in details as well. So the very beginning of the respiratory passageway is our nose. So it's not only where we kind of smell the smells of the area, but has a role in terms of kind of conditioning the air that we breathe in. In terms of the conditioning of the air that we breathe in, because of the serous membrane that we have, it produces a serous fluid that moistens the air that we breathe in. It also, because of the great number of the blood vessels that we have within our nose, it warms the air that we breathe in. Also, because of its tissue that we have, it has mucus and it also has the cells that are ciliated. It can filter and also clean the air that we breathe in. Some other functions, it also functions as a resonating chamber for speech. And then we all know that whenever we are stuffed up due to some kind of a congestion in there, our kind of voices change as well. So in the nasal cavity, there are two different types of tissues that line the nasal cavity. Majority of it is what's called the respiratory mucosa, and this is the one that has the mucus cells and the serous cells and all those. The olfactory mucosa, this is part of the nose, especially in the roof of the nasal cavity, where we have the sensory cells, the olfactory cells, which is for the sense of the smell. And these are the only neurons of our body that their axons of the axonal terminals are actually exposed to the outside. And these are the ones that we actually have the sense of the smell, allowing us to smell the different smells. Now, within the respiratory mucosa, like I said, the cells of the respiratory mucosa, they produce the fluids that, in addition to not only it moistens the air and kind of, just traps and so on and so forth, but we have some natural antibodies, the lysozymes and the fensins, that actually are natural antibiotics that help us to clean the area. So they have antibacterial functions to them too. Connected to our nasal cavity are what we call the paranasal sinuses, and these are the cavities in our bones. We have the sinuses in the frontal bone, sphenoid bones, ethmoid bone, and maxillary bones. All of them, these empty cavities or hollow cavities, open up into the nasal cavity. Functions of the sinuses specifically, being an airhead, that's basically what we have in there, so they lighten our skull and also warm and moisten the air as well. So within the nose, we have these elevations and bony ridges that are known as nasal conches, and then right underneath the conches we have these kind of little dips underneath it that are known as nasal meatus. So the function of the conchae and the meati, or the meatus, is to increase the surface area, right, and allow for the air to kind of pass through and then do turbulence. So there's hair, and then all those sorts of olfactory mucosa kind of sits right up here, passes through the ethmoid bone, that goes into the axons. The neurons pass through and go into the olfactory bulb, so we have the sense of the smell. Separating the nasal cavity from the oral cavity is our hard palate, and then the soft palate, and then at the very end of it, that little dangly thingy, the uvula, we have one of the tonsils right over here. So this is our palatine tonsil. Of the sinuses, the one that we can see in here is our frontal sinus, and then here is one of the sphenoidal sinuses. We don't see the maxillaries or the ethmoid sinuses there. So that would be the ethmoid bone. If I said sphenoid, I was wrong there. That's the ethmoid bone. Some of the other structures in here that I really need you guys to know is that right about where the nasopharynx, we have the pharyngeal tonsils. Remember, in the lymphatic system, we talked about the pharyngeal tonsils, and these are called the adenoids. So this area is called the nasopharynx. This area is called the oropharynx. And then this is the laryngeal pharynx, or the laryngopharynx. So we'll talk about the pharynx, or our throat. One of the other structures that we can identify within our, towards the posterior end of our nasal cavity, or within the nasopharynx, is this one opening over here, which is the opening of the pharyngotympanic, also known as our eustachian tube. This is the one that usually drains the air from the middle ear into the pharynx, and alleviates the pressure, and then allows for the balance of the air pressure inside of our middle ear. Down in here, so we have the pharyngeal tonsils over there. Back here, where we have the just the base, not base of the tongue underneath it, but the posterior section where we have the soft palate. We have the palatine tonsil that's located there, and then these are the ones that are called the linguals. So in the lymphatic system, we'll learn that the job of the tonsils is to clean the air, and then it's strategically located. In this sagittal view, we can also identify part of the airways that get separated from our food passageway. So pharynx has a common passageway between the respiratory system and the digestive system. Part of it, nasopharynx, is just air. Oropharynx and the laryngopharynx allow for food and air to pass through. So as we breathe the air in, right, and comes in, so goes down into and goes into airways. Now this area right here is our larynx, or our voice box. So we will talk about the larynx, our voice box, and the components of the larynx, and then what are those in just a second. So an airways goes down in here, and this little structure over here, which is called the epiglottis, that little flap actually falls over and covers and obstructs the airways as we swallow the food down. So the food is going to go down into the esophagus, not the airways. So pharynx, so that was the nasal cavity, pharynx. There are three distinct regions to pharynx. We have the nasopharynx. So components of the nasopharynx are our tonsils right about there, the adenoids over there, and also the opening of the pharyngotympanic tube. This blue section that you could see is called the oropharynx. Components of the oropharynx, it's primarily what we find over there, is the palatine tonsil and the lingual tonsils. So this area of the pharynx, from here and below, all the way down to where you see the green, this is the common passageway for both food and air. Nasopharynx, on the other hand, is only and only allows for the air to pass through. So if you've ever had this kind of situation that you've been drinking something, and all of a sudden somebody made you laugh, or for whatever reason, when you cough, that liquid, if it goes upward, and that comes out of your nose, and that's neither pretty nor pleasant. So yeah. There are some people which freak me out. On Ripley's Believe It or Not, there's this one guy that I saw him some time ago. He was actually drinking milk and then squeezing it, coming up from his eye. So I got to think that, how in the heck does he do that? So he's drinking milk, and then he's got so much control over all these muscles around here. These are skeletal muscle, that he could push it up his nose into the lacrimal duct, which is a tear duct, and in the corner of his eye, which is, you see the drop of milk. Like I said, it kind of freaked me out, but, people do strange things. So, here there's all the ums and ahs and hins and ums that you hear me when I talk about these things. All those are coming from my voice box. Our voice box, just like I said, this kind of smacking sound. I kind of notice that I make all sorts of noises when I talk, but then again, what am I going to do? So, our voice box is our larynx, and don't call it larynx. It has 9 cartilages, okay? 9 cartilages. We're going to name these cartilages, and then tell you guys that, what is the function of each one of them. So, now, these cartilages, so this is a cartilaginous structure that keeps the airway open. So, it's not a muscular tube. As air passes through, it kind of stays open nicely. So, these 9 cartilages, let me refresh my mind and then see what am I talking about here. These 9 cartilages, so I'm just going to name them. There's one down here, right? There's one right here. There's one right here. So there's 3. So there's single ones. And there's, 3 pairs, so 6. The arytenoids, corniculate, the coracoid, epiglottis, thyroid cartilage, and then the cuneiform, right? So of these, the cuneiforms, which is this one, so this is the cuneiform. Then we have the corniculate, which is this one, okay? And then this one that I have an arrow on, this is called the arytenoid. And the reason that I have the arrow on the arytenoid is because I want to talk about the vocal cords in just a second, all right? So, the cuneiform, the corniculate, and the arytenoid. There is 2 of each, so that's 6, right? 3 times 2, 6. Coracoid, 7. Thyroid, 8. Epiglottis, 9. So there is 9 different cartilages make up the structure of the larynx. Now, larynx is continuous with the trachea, and then from the coracoid cartilage down below we have the C-ring cartilages of the trachea, and these cartilaginous structures are important to keep the airways patent open, right? So not only that, but it also the switching mechanism in there, especially the epiglottis, is what allows for the food to be routed into the esophagus and prevent that from coming down into our airways. Other functions of the larynx is to actually allow us to produce voice. I'm not talking about speech. Speech has to do with the muscles that are in our tongue and their pharynx and then mouth and all those. This is voice. For example, you can just go like this or go right? So the pitch and the tone. I know you're just laughing off right now. What kind of crazy things am I doing here? But I would have done the same thing if I were in a class. So the pitch of our sound actually comes from the fact that we could use our vocal cords. So speaking of the vocal cords, we're looking into 2 sets of these. So let me just kind of clean this up a little bit. 2 sets of vocal cords. So we have the ones, that are kind of have this. So this was the arytenoid cartilage. There's 2 of those. And then of these, the one that are up top are called vestibular folds. Okay, these are called the vestibular folds or false vocal cords. And the one down below here, this one down below here with this arrow that I have in a yellow dot on it, this is actually the true vocal cords. Now, the true vocal cords are attached posteriorly to the arytenoid cartilages, anteriorly to the thyroid cartilage, right? So they are anchored in place. So these are nice and kind of cartilaginous or collagenous bands of tissue that expand from front to back of the larynx. I'm such a klutz. I dropped my little pen. Okay, so in here, this is another view of larynx. So we're looking into the actual vocal cords. So these are the true vocal cords, right? And then the opening between the two is called glottis. The ones that are over this one, these are the vestibular or false vocal cords. The difference between the two is that the vibration of the true vocal cords generates that voice, and these, the false ones over it, are the ones that are actually protecting the true ones. Now, so when we kind of give ourselves this particular thing which is known as Valsalva maneuver, and that is when we close the glottis completely, especially during defecation, and when the pressure inside of the abdomen increases to help with the emptying of the bowel. So you're going to remember that one. These vocal cords that are attached to the thyroid cartilage and then also the arytenoid cartilages at puberty, especially in boys, when testosterone is produced, the cartilages, especially the thyroid cartilage, which becomes their Adam's apple, kind of increases in size. But the vocal cords do not grow at the same rate. And that is the reason that the boys, when they hit puberty, they have that kind of a creaky sound that every once in a while, you hear them squeak and a squawk. So it's due to the fact that thyroid cartilage or Adam's apple grows faster than the vocal cords do, and that kind of an extra pulling on the vocal cords generates that kind of a funky sound that they have. So glottis, true vocal cords, false vocal cords, Valsalva's maneuver, and the functions of the vocals. So from the last cartilages, or last cartilage of the larynx, which is a coracoid cartilage, our trachea or windpipe extends down in the center of our chest, which is called mediastinum or mediastinum. So this is about almost 4 inches long, somewhere between 10 to 12 centimeters. And in most people, it's about almost a little bit less than an inch wide. Now, in terms of the tissue, the histology of the trachea, I want to get your attention to this image right about here. So there are 3 layers that make the tissue of the trachea. The innermost layer, which is called the mucous membrane, and a mucous membrane is the pseudostratified ciliated columnar tissue. If you want to remember what this was, go back to the first anatomy and have a look at this tissue type. So that's the mucous membrane. The next layer, which is called the submucosa layer, actually has like about somewhere between 16 to 20 C-shaped cartilages in its structure. These cartilages are made of hyaline cartilage, and the presence of these C-shaped cartilages in the structure of the trachea is critical because it keeps the trachea rigid and open for the air to pass through. The outermost layer of the tracheal tissue is called adventitia. So mucosa is ciliated, pseudostratified ciliated columnar tissue. The submucosa has actually cartilages, the hyaline cartilage, C-shaped cartilages, and then the adventitia. Now, the C-shaped cartilages are actually incomplete. So in the backside, right, in the backside of the trachea, right about this area over here, we have this layer of the muscle that actually goes all the way. This is, if this is the back end of it, goes all the way from one end to the next. So it kind of lines the back side of the trachea. So anteriorly, trachea is cartilaginous. Posteriorly, trachea has a kind of a thin sheet of muscle, which is called the trachealis muscle, right? Behind the trachealis muscle, posteriorly, we have our esophagus, which is our food pipe. So this muscle over here, the trachealis muscle, actually structurally is really important because it allows, as we swallow the food, to go down the esophagus with ease, because the esophagus is also muscular, and the food, as we swallow it, kind of expands. So the presence of this trachealis muscle is important for the passage of food. So mucosa is made up a ciliated columnar, and in the ciliated columnar we have goblet cells that produce lots and lots of mucus. Submucosa, it's deeper to the mucosa, and then the adventitia actually kind of covers these serine cartilages that are made of hyaline cartilage, and then posteriorly trachealis muscle completes the structure of the trachea, but it also allows for the esophagus to expand as we swallow the food down. So from here, we're going to move on down into trachea and then bronchies and talk about the tracheobronchial tree. At the level of the last cartilage in the trachea, which is called the carina, and it's kind of like a figure 8 shape. It's not really. So kind of has this almost incomplete figure 8 shape in it, like so. Trachea splits into 2 airways, and these are called the primary bronchies. So we have the right primary bronchus and the left primary bronchus. Right primary bronchus obviously extends down into the right lung, and the left primary bronchus extends into the left lung. These are the primary bronchi. From there, on the right side and the left side, these primary bronchies split into even more branches. On the right side, we have the right primary splits into 3, and these are called the secondaries, right? So 3 secondaries on the right and 2 secondaries on the left. The reason for this is because the left lung has 2 lobes, and you guessed it, the right lung has 3 lobes. So to supply air to each lobe on the left, primary bronchus splits into 2. One goes into the superior lobe and one goes into the inferior lobe. On the right side, we have 3 branches coming off. One goes into the superior lobe, one goes into the middle lobe, and one goes into the inferior lobe. So the secondary bronchies are also called lobars, all right? Supply air to each lobe. So lobar bronchies, or the secondary bronchies, 3 on the right and 2 on the left. From there, the secondaries split into these sections that are called segmentals, or bronchopulmonary segments. These bronchopulmonary segments, there is 10 of them in each lung, with a little bit of a difference between the two, but I want you guys to know this one, that these bronchopulmonary segments, each one of them has its own 3rd division. So that's the 1st division, that's the 2nd division, and these are the 3rd division of the airways. So each one of them is split into 10 3rd division of these airways. Each one of these segments of the lungs has one airway, and then the blood vessels as well. So, and then each one of these bronchopulmonary segments are actually covered and separated from each other by a layer of a connective tissue sheet. So they do have this kind of a segmented, we have these segmented structures in our lung tissue. Now, the importance of this bronchopulmonary segments is for, when there is any kind of a problem with one of these segments, a surgeon can remove one segment without kind of, you know, just damaging the rest of the area. So it also prevents the spread of the infections and then cancer and so on and so forth. So the third division would be the segmental bronchs. From there, we have 23 times division and branching of these airways in the lung tissue, right? So you got the first one, which is the primaries, the second one, which are the lobars, the third one, which are the segmentals, the fourth and the fifth and the sixth and the seventh, 23. As these airways that are conductive airways become smaller and smaller, so in here, the trachea by itself is about, you know, about 2 centimeters, so it's less than an inch, right? Less than an inch, 2 centimeters, which is 20 millimeters, right? It's 20 millimeters. I'm going to give it to you guys in metric, so you know when I get to the bronchioles. So these airways, a tracheobronchial tree, as we go into the divisions, every division, the airway becomes smaller and smaller. So not only the size changes, but also we have structural changes that occur too. In terms of the size, by the time that we get to the level of the bronchioles, those are the smallest of the airways, and their size is about 0.5 millimeter. So we went from 20 millimeter to 0.5 millimeter. These are extremely tiny airways. These are called the bronchioles, right? These bronchioles structurally are very different from trachea. So the structural differences is that in here we have the pseudostratified ciliated. As we go down into the secondaries and the tertiaries and so on and so forth, not only the mucosa and epithelium changes, we go from the pseudostratified ciliated to cuboidal to squamous in the mucosa layer. Now, in the middle layer, right, in the middle layer, with the cartilages and all of that, the amount of the cartilage decreases continuously until eventually, once we get to the level of those bronchioles, there is no cartilage left, okay? And there is no mucus-producing cells. No cartilage, no mucus-producing cells. All the bronchiole is a tiny little tube of a smooth muscle. So we went from a 20 millimeter tube to 0.5 millimeter tube, a tube with the pseudostratified and mucus-producing cells, to a tube which is only smooth muscle with no mucus-producing cells, no cartilage support, and no mucus-producing cells. This is the branching of the tracheobronchial tree. So we went from the conductive zone all the way to the respiratory zone down below here, which is going to lead into the alveolar ducts and alveolar sacs that contain the alveoli that allows for the exchange of the gases to happen. So visual of the tracheobronchial tree, you can see it better here. Trachea, right about 4 inches long within the mediastinum, sits and then ends at carina, which is that little cartilage. It always kind of makes me laugh because to me it kind of looks like a bikini bottom. This reminds me of a SpongeBob. Anyway, so here's the left main bronchus. This is the right main bronchus. There's a difference in terms of their width of the two, and also the angle of the left and the right bronchs with each other. So the primaries split into two on the left side. So we have lobars, or the secondaries. You need to know that, and then the segmentals, that are the tertiaries. So the third division is the tertiary, and then the second division is the secondaries or lobar, and the third division is the tertiaries or the segmentals, right? Mentioned that the segmentals, there's about 10 of them in each lung, and each one of them has its own airways and blood vessels, and each one has a membrane surrounding it, so easily can be. So lobes, there's 2 on the left, 3 on the right. Segments, 10 in each. And the airways become smaller and smaller as they come through. A couple of things that I want to mention here is that the width, the kind of the opening and the size of the left main and the right is different from each other. The left side is kind of narrower, okay, and longer, and it has more of a nice little angle to it. Right, on the other hand, is wider and shorter, and it's kind of more of a vertical position. For that reason, in a lot of cases, if anything passes through the carina, which I'll tell you guys something about in just a second, and then kind of goes into any foreign object that passes through, it actually, possibility of it landing in the right side is greater than the left side, okay? Carina, the tissue of the carina actually has some sensitive receptors in it, that these receptors respond to any particle and will initiate a cough reflex. So sometimes, that cough reflex is really violent, but the purpose for the cough is to actually expel whatever it is, that has gone down and down the trachea and have reached the carina. Well, I mean, all my efforts to make these slides all kind of nice and pretty, it's kind of gone to the waste because this little system over here apparently doesn't like extra stuff in the slides. P.S. and by the way, I post the slides, the PowerPoints, on Canvas as well, just in case that some of these don't make any sense to you guys. For example, these are actually arrows, so I was trying to kind of give you guys direction here that, how these splitting of the airways and then what happens over here. So this is actually what we'll call the respiratory zone. Any place in the respiratory passageway that there are alveoli present and allows for the gas exchange to happen, we call that area or call that region the respiratory zone. Okay, so the terminal bronchioles right here that have, kind of clusters and a scatter pieces of the alveoli attached to them, probably that's where the respiratory zone starts. And the respiratory zone, again, defines where the gas exchange is happening. So the terminal bronchioles will lead into what we call the respiratory bronchioles, and the respiratory bronchioles will lead into what we call an alveolar duct. An alveolar duct is where we have the clusters of alveoli attached. So an average of approximately 300 million alveoli are within the tissue of the lungs, because these are air sacs, and then they have a great amount of elastic fibers in them. That's why the lung tissue is very light, highly porous, contains all these air sacs, and extremely elastic. So these alveoli make up the most of the volume of the lung tissue. Now, these 300 million alveoli, I have seen estimates of about half of a volleyball court to a tennis court to a football field surface area that allows for the gas exchange. So this is a tremendous amount of the surface area for the gas exchange. So not only that, it's really important to understand, but also we have these tiny little holes in between alveoli. So alveoli are not completely isolated from each other, but these tiny little holes that are called alveolar pores are in between alveoli that allow for the air to pass through, from one alveoli to the next, to the next, to the next. So this image in this area kind of shows us where the, how is the branching of the respiratory passageways and what signifies the respiratory zone, the presence of the alveoli. Now, mention that, we have the respiratory zone, and that's where the gas exchange happens. So gas exchange, where's the, where the gases move, right? The gases move from the alveolus into the capillaries of the pulmonary circuit, all right? So air comes in through here, air has higher oxygen content to it. And then the capillaries of the alveoli, I should have kind of done that one. Oh, let me do this again. I want to do it in a different color. So if we say that, here's the alveolus, right, one of them, and then here is the pulmonary capillary that had brought CO2, high CO2, low oxygen with it, right? This is the pulmonary circulation. So to remind you, pulmonary circulation comes from pulmonary trunk on the right ventricle, goes into the pulmonary arteries, and each one of those goes into one of the lungs. And the pulmonaries branch and branch and branch and branch until eventually pulmonary capillaries arise from those arterioles. These pulmonary capillaries contain the blood that comes from the right side of the heart. And if you remember, the right side has low oxygen, high carbon dioxide with it. And that's why I decided to draw it in blue. So we have oxygen in the air, all right? And then, I gotta use black. I don't have any other colors. And then CO2 in here. High oxygen concentration in the alveolus, high oxygen concentration in the pulmonary blood. So oxygen has to cross over from the walls of the alveolus into the interstitial spaces, into the pulmonary capillary, and CO2 has to go through the pulmonary capillary into the interstitial spaces, into the air sac. This is, in a nutshell, gas exchange between the alveolus and the pulmonary circuit. These membranes that I just talked about are the ones that actually form our respiratory membrane. And I'm going to talk about this respiratory membrane or blood-air barrier. So in the alveolus, the walls of the alveoli, we have different types of cells in there. The majority of the cells of the alveolus are the ones that we call type 1 epithelial cells. These are the cells that are squamous, okay? These cells are the ones that actually allow for the diffusion to happen. So the gas exchange happens through the walls of the type 1. In between type 1s, we have this other type of cells that are called type 2 cells. Type 2 cells produce a material called surfactant. Surfactant stands for surface acting agent, okay? So it stands for surface acting agent, surfactant. Later on, I will talk about the role of the surfactant and the cohesiveness of the water molecules. These cells also produce ACE. Remember ACE? Angiotensin converting enzyme? So the angiotensin converting enzyme is produced not only by liver cells, but also by lung cells as well. So people who have lung cancer, sometimes they also develop high blood pressure as well because they have high levels of ACE. It converts angiotensin 1 in angiotensin 2, and angiotensin 2 is a vasoconstrictor, so could lead into high blood pressure. Now, so this is the alveolus. Now, on the other end of it, we have the capillary, right? Capillary is made of a single layer of a smooth of a epithelial cell, and that's the endothelium, right? And also, this is this epithelial tissue. This one is also epithelial tissue. So both of them have basal lamina. Also, you've probably heard me saying basement membrane, right? Basement membrane. So the combination of alveolar walls and its basement membrane, capillary wall and its basement membrane together forms what we call the respiratory membrane. This is where the gases have to go across. Oxygen has to go across from type 1 into the basement membrane, pass through the walls of the capillaries, and attach to the hemoglobin molecule. CO2 has to go through the capillary wall, basement membrane, and pass through the type 1 and then get into the alveolar sac. This is how the exchange of the gases happens over here. Now, in between these cells, also we have these little macrophages that actually maintain a nice, clean air content within the alveolar sacs. Okay. Now there is about 2 million of these 2 million cells we do have that kind of die per hour. So these macrophages are really, really busy. Imagine that, if even, so we have all these things that produce that they need to gobble up. But also if we live in environment which is really polluted, that kind of adds up to their load. Visuals, moving on down into from the terminal bronchiole into the respiratory bronchiole that has kind of scattered alveolar sacs with tiny little pores in between that allows to air to be just balanced in between. Surrounding the alveoli, we have these nice little elastic fibers, right? Elastic fibers, and this contributes to the elasticity of the lung tissue, and then the capillaries of the pulmonary circuit. This close relationship, so the pulmonary capillaries literally cover the alveoli like a sleeve over your arm. Just imagine that, right? They're literally kind of surrounding this, and they're so close to each other that makes the exchange of the air extremely easy and extremely rapid and fast. Here's what I want you to pay a little attention. So the walls of the alveoli right here, okay, are made of type 1 cells. These type 1 cells is where the gas exchange happens. You have to remember that. Scattered in between, we have type 2 that the job is to produce the surfactant. So surfactant is a detergent, and I'm going to talk about that, right? These are the pores that allow for the air pressure to be equalized between all the different alveoli. And then the macrophages that are, kind of just traveling in between, not in between, but kind of, they go around and then look for things that they can eat. Now, here is our respiratory membrane. On the image on the right side, you see the respiratory membrane. Components of the respiratory membrane include alveolar epithelium, okay, so that's the type 1 cells of the alveolus. It's an epithelial tissue. It has basement membrane, so that's very thin connective tissue. That's where the epithelial cells kind of sit on it, right? So that's the fused membranes of the alveole and the capillary, and then the endothelium of the capillary. This is the respiratory membrane, meaning that oxygen goes from alveolus, passes through, goes into the lung, into the blood vessel, and is picked up by hemoglobin inside of the red blood cell. CO2 is released from the blood into the alveolus. This is the process which is known as external respiration. Not to worry about it, but I'm going to talk about external respiration as we get into the gas exchange and look at that process. Coming towards the end of this lecture, talking about the structures of the respiratory system. So in here, we'll talk about the fact that the lungs, in terms of their gross anatomy, are located in the chest cavity, and each one of them has its own pleural membrane. Now, the diaphragmatic part of the lung is where it actually kind of sits right here. It kind of just sits, and it's connected to the central tendon of the diaphragm through this pleural membrane. Left lung has 2 lobes, superior and inferior, and then this little dip between the two, it's called the oblique fissure, that separates the superior and inferior lobe from each other. Right lung, on the other hand, has 3 lobes, the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe. So in addition to the oblique fissure, we also have a horizontal fissure that separates the superior and middle from each other. These kind of a hexagonal shapes that you do see over here, those kind of signifies those little bronchopulmonary segments in the lung tissue. Surrounding the lung tissue, right, are the pleural membranes. Pleural membranes, it's include the layer, so this is a double layer serous membrane, layer that lines the inside of the chest cavity, so kind of sits right attached to inside of the bones right there. It's known as parietal pleura. Kind of folds over and comes and covers the surface of the lung, which I'm going to color it in blue. This is called a visceral pleura. And there is this tiny little space between the two, which is known as the pleural cavity. Pleural cavity contains a small amount of fluid. We'll take a look at the condition of disease of the lungs, when the lungs collapsed. We're going to talk about pneumothorax and atelectasis once we get into that one. So pleurals, parietal, and visceral, and a tiny little space between the two, which is known as the cavity. Other things that I want to mention would be that this area, which is known as the hilus, is actually where we have the entrance of the pulmonary artery, primary bronchus, pulmonary vein. So this kind of come in and exit in this area. One of the other distinct structures that we do see a difference between right and the left lung is that in the left lung, right, this area over here, there is this kind of a little dip, which is called a cardiac notch. And this cardiac notch allows for the apex of the heart to nestle in. So left has the cardiac notch, but the right does not. This concludes the gross anatomy of the lungs. In terms of the circulation to the lung tissue, there are two sets of circulation that we have. One is the pulmonary circuit. So we've talked about the purpose of the pulmonary circuit. So the pulmonary arteries come off of the pulmonary trunk on the right side, and they have venous blood that has low oxygen, high CO2. And as they go into the lung tissue, they keep on branching along with the bronchs. Remember how they branched like about 23 times? And eventually, they kind of lead into the pulmonary capillaries that surround the alveoli. Now, from here, when this pulmonary or the microcirculation merge together, then they come together and they form the pulmonary veins. And pulmonary veins actually have blood in them, which is highly oxygenated, and it returns it to the heart. This is the pulmonary circuit. So you know this one. We've talked about this one in great detail before. Now, the second system of the circulatory vessels are called bronchial arteries, and bronchial arteries actually supply blood to the lung tissue. Purpose of this one is the gas exchange. Purpose of this one is to supply the lung tissue. They come from the aorta, okay? And then everywhere except for the alveoli is where we have the vessels, the bronchial artery supply. Now, the innervation by the autonomic nervous system, I know I've written that down. Let me see, where is this? Okay, so the innervation of the lung tissue by the autonomic nervous system. If you remember from first anatomy, you remember autonomic nervous system has actually sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So similar to most of the organs, lungs are also duly innervated. So we have the neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system and neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, right? So through the what we call the pulmonary plexus, they kind of run along and then go into the along the bronchial tubes and along the vessels into the lung tissue. Now, what I want you to remember from this innervation is that parasympathetic nervous system causes the bronchioles to constrict. Okay, so parasympathetic nervous system, when stimulated, when it releases its neurotransmitter, will cause the bronchioles to constrict. All right, this is in some conditions like asthma. Anything happens if parasympathetic nervous system becomes excited and sends stimulatory signals to the muscles of the bronchioles. Remember, bronchioles were only muscle. There's no cartilage in there, so they're only made of muscle tissue. So when parasympathetic nervous system fires up, bronchioles constrict. So the constriction of the bronchioles will block the airways to the alveoli. Okay, so what happens if the air doesn't reach the alveoli? We're not going to be able to do the gas exchange, correct? So, for example, in an asthma attack, right, if a person has an asthma attack, that's where the parasympathetic nervous system fires up. Now, what do you give to a person who's got an asthma attack? You will give him usually an inhaler, which is a bronchodilator. These bronchodilators are a group of pharmaceuticals. Specifically, either they have epinephrine, which is produced by the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, and it's a bronchodilator, or other bronchodilators which could antagonize the parasympathetic nervous system. So in the lung tissue, parasympathetic nervous system will constrict the bronchioles, sympathetic nervous system will dilate the bronchioles. So one of the other ways that I could explain this one is that in a fight or flight situation, when the sympathetic nervous system fires up, bronchioles open, so allows us to breathe better and faster, and also the blood that's kind of rerouted to heart and the muscles and the lung tissue. So the job of the sympathetic nervous system is to send more blood to the lung tissue and the heart, but also, so you also, with a person who's got allergic reactions, to things, when they start to kind of feel tightness in their chest, and that means that their bronchioles are constricting, you just give them like an epi shot, right? An EpiPen or epi shot for people who have an allergic reaction, to the bee stings or peanuts and so on and so forth. So epi comes from the sympathetic nervous system. The long-winded explanation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the pleural, I already talked about those. This is the serous membrane that covers the lung. The parietal pleura covers the internal surface of the thoracic wall, and a visceral pleura sits tightly on the surface of the lung tissue. So space between the two is known as the pleural cavity, and then abnormal conditions, pleural effusion, anytime that there's a fluid accumulated in there due to the failure of the right side, we may have accumulation of the fluid in there, and also any kind of an inflammation of the pleura is known as the pleurisy.